And welcome back, everybody, here to the Rice Report, our interview series. Today, we are joined by former Congressman Louie Gohmert. Spent almost 20 years, I think, in Washington, D.C., serving on various different committees, judicial, various different committees down in Washington, D.C., and has a very good scope, very close with President Trump and the new administration. We're going to go through a bunch of different topics, ranging from the trials ahead of getting people appointed and in position, the drones that are hovering over the United States, Bitcoin, a bunch of different topics that we're going to cover here. But if you will, all please welcome Louie Gohmert to the show today. Louie, it's so great to have you here. Thank you for
It's great
taking the
being
time
with
with
you,
us.
Eric. Thank you.
Well, Louie, let's start with some of President Trump's appointees. I think that there are, Kash Patel is obviously a firebrand that we're all interested in learning about. It's very interesting. I want to get your opinion on what happened with Matt Gaetz. I think that's a topic many people are confused. I'm confused about. And some of the appointees that you see as being very simple picks and very difficult picks. So, out of the appointees, and I know you're a politician, so you got to be a little careful on these things. What are some of
Sure.
your favorite picks that Trump has made? Your favorite and least favorite appointees that he's made thus far?
Well, he's made a bunch of great appointments that I'm excited about. And, some people that I don't really know because he's made so many. But what I do know is that this 4 years in the wilderness, so to speak, has been very productive for President Trump. He is a thinker, despite what some may say, he's a thinker. And he has been thinking a lot about what he will do, who he will get around him in the next administration. And so then when he won and was declared, I knew he was going to win. I was just hoping and praying he'd be declared the winner. And he was. It was too big to rig. But there are still big bumps ahead. And, Eric, we came within an eyelash in this country founded on the idea of freedom and private property and meritocracy where you could go get ahead not by who your family was but by what you did, and we were coming so close to fulfilling Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that people would be judged by by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And then in recent years, and it really goes to the beginning of Obama's term when he pledged he was going to fundamentally transform America. He began pushing us in a direction of judging people by the color of their skin and not by their merit, not by what they've done, not by their character. So it's been a very dangerous time. And we were so close to voting in a Marxist president, which would mean, well, let's look at the things Biden has done. So much of them were clearly Marxist leaning, Marxist ideas, government control, keep people in the dark, and of course, with Marxism, you do have corruption. And there was certainly plenty of that. And maybe a guilty conscience is what inspired President Biden to pardon so many government people who defrauded their government that they were working for, the taxpayers they were working for. But nonetheless, we were so close to voting in a Marxist here. So let me
Absolutely.
just tell you up front, Eric, they're not going to go away quietly into that good night. They they were so close that they were almost giddy. Get Kamala Harris in, and with the Marxist beginnings that had been implemented under Obama and then and carried out and extended further under Biden, we were close to voting in a Marxist regime. And thank God and thank all the hard workers that we have another chance. And Trump has used this time. He's been preparing, he's been thinking, and it's really been a wonder to behold. So he doesn't come into these appointments just flippantly tossing them out. He's been thinking about this for a long time. Now, under the law, that clear, the first thing that you do before you take the oath is sign a sworn statement that you have not promised anyone a job in your administration. You can say things like, hey,
Hmm.
I want to take you with me, or I'd love to have working, but you cannot promise a job in the administration before you're elected. So he's been careful about that, but clearly the appointments reflect a lot of thought.
Yes. Yes, and of course, Kash Patel just pops into my mind in the
Yeah,
FBI. That
yeah,
seems to be an
yeah.
era that we need serious cleanup to happen. I mean, our
Oh,
FBI is not working for us; they're working against us at this point in time.
yeah,
What do you think about that
you're
appointment of
totally
Kash? He's very young.
Yeah, but he was working with Devin Nunes and a number of people, and he showed his colors during the first Trump administration that he cared deeply about freedom and about government working for the people, not against them. And he was, like so many of us, very disturbed to see the FBI and the DOJ weaponized to go after Republicans and conservatives and Christians and parents that just care about their kids. So you will see a very determined Kash Patel, and that scares people. And so I'm sure that his hearings will be fraught with all kinds of garbage that will be thrown at him. And I'm hoping, praying, and know he's working to make sure that he gets through those. But we've got to have senators, Republican senators, stand firm. Eric, you nailed it. I mean, the, let me put it to you this way: you before we went on, you talked about reviewing my history.
Mhm.
Well, I've been a prosecutor. I've been a defense attorney. I have been a law and order judge, handling all kind of felonies, including death penalty cases. I've been a chief justice, and I've invested in the Army. I
Mhm.
was in the Trials Defense Service. I owed the Army 4 years from a scholarship at Texas A&M, and I didn't want to be a defense attorney, but we had one had a heart attack and died. I was the only one with the trial experience to do it. They shoved me in there, and so that's where I
Against your
served.
will, huh? It's
Well, but I always took my oath very seriously,
of course.
and actually, when the commanding general handpicks every one of the jurors, and you've got no peremptories to strike any of the jurors. You're stuck with exactly who the commanding general that sent this case to court martial put in the jury box. You can't expect a whole lot of acquittals, but actually, I did have acquittals, murder, attempted murder, in cases where my client was innocent, and we were able to get that jury verdict consistent with that. So I've had a lot of experience, and let me tell you, through the '80s and my years on the bench in the '90s, I told my wife, because I was friends with so many FBI agents, look, if something happens to me, you call these FBI agents and you work with them no matter what. I trusted them with my life back in those days. But let me tell you, after getting to Congress, it is not the same FBI. And I think Mueller and Comey had a lot to do with destroying their reputation by playing politics with it. And then Christopher Wray followed that up. That was a mistake. He should never have been FBI director. In my opinion, he's a very dishonest person and should never have been appointed there. But anytime you see the
I
Democrats,
think most of America would agree with you at this point. Most of conservative
well,
America would
so
agree.
I'm glad he's resigned. But now, oh, and even initially when I got to Congress, I'd say, well, if the FBI wants to talk to you, don't be afraid. I'm telling you, Eric, if the FBI, anybody, even people you know and you trust, say they need to talk to you, uh, you should say one thing and one thing only. And I'm not giving legal advice, though I have a law license. I'm just telling you in a friendly setting, let them know that you will be glad to talk through your attorney, but you're not saying a word until you have the attorney. I mean, that's there representing you, because you can't trust them. And one of the things that I've challenged Mueller and Comey and Ray about the 302s. It's based on a paragraph in their procedure. But after an agent talks to a potential witness, they are to go back as soon as possible and write down their version of what they believe or they think they recall the witness said. And as I've told Ray before, I don't I'm not even trying to bring you guys into the 21st century. If we could just get you up to the 1990s, where
Right.
every law enforcement entity in the country, from the smallest constable office to the biggest in the big cities, they record their statements.
Everything. That's right.
And to have the FBI use this archaic tool of doing a statement, and then they can use it to impeach your testimony at trial, and it's their recollection, and then we know in the case of Mike Flynn, we don't know what happened to the original 302, and we don't know who did the new amended 302 to make it look like he was guilty of something, but the original one didn't. So these are the kind of things that make you go, no matter if you've got FBI friends, you cannot talk to them without an attorney present. And I continue to believe that now until we get this thing cleaned up. And I think Kash Patel can go a long way toward doing that. But you want to know one of the root uh, problems that I saw, and I called it out when it was happening to get us where we are, where you have an untrustworthy FBI.
Of course.
I mean, I majored in history. I knew I was going to the army. I
I
majored
was going
where
to
I
ask this
was.
question too. Where did it all begin? Where did it turn wrong?
Mueller as FBI director, Eric, he implemented a program called the 5-year up or out program. Now,
Hmm.
it sounds innocuous enough, but what it means is when you're in a leadership position in an FBI office anywhere in the world for 5 years, then you have a choice. You can come work in a cubicle in Washington or you can get out.
Hmm.
We lost. I talked to so many FBI agents that were working under Mueller and going, I'm not going to Washington. I have a reputation. And by the way, it takes about 5 years before local law enforcement will really trust a federal agent because they've been
Hmm.
burned so many times where you do all the work and then they come riding in, do the press conference, take all the credit. And in some cases, like I was aware of, sometimes they were an impediment to actually getting the perpetrator you were trying to arrest. So it takes about 5 years for an FBI agent to get that kind of reputation. This is a guy we can trust. This is a guy we want with us. Well, 5 years as a leader, as a special agent in charge, you had a decision. And so we
Hmm.
lost thousands and thousands and thousands of years of 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 service of FBI, their experience, the people
The
that
trust.
had seen mistakes made that could say to Mueller, you know, sir, I know that seems like a good idea, but 12 years ago we tried what you're suggesting, and here's what happened. If I might suggest this, Mueller did not want anything but yes men. And so he was getting rid of the people that provided the conventional knowledge and wisdom of mistakes to avoid or replicating. He didn't want those. He wanted a group of yes people in his FBI, and that's what he got. And then I raised enough Cain about it that he eventually changed it toward the end toward a 7-year up or out. But these are people that loved law enforcement. They didn't want to go sit in a cube in Washington D.C., and so he moved them out. And those that did, they realized right away they got to be yes people. They can't do anything. So there were huge
Wow.
mistakes made during the Mueller regime. Have you ever heard that? But
I
that's
haven't. I
where
haven't heard
I
about the
see,
five up and out. I haven't heard that
yeah,
before.
yeah, up or out, yeah. And so that's what I saw from the outside of the FBI changed the FBI to people that were willing to just do whatever they were told, even though they knew it wasn't a good idea. They knew it violated the rules of law enforcement. I mean, come
Mm.
on, sending SWAT teams to nonviolent people just to send a message.
To
That is
parents, yeah.
not the old FBI. The old FBI, some nonviolent uh, person that was going to be indicted, their lawyer would get a call and say, "Hey, your client needs to show up at this jail at this time. Otherwise, he'll be considered to be trying to get away, and we'll introduce that at trial." Well, they would show up at the jail. If they're a violent threat, sure. But I mean, you saw things, if you remember back to Gibson guitars, I think that was the EPA, or I'm not sure which one, but they sent a SWAT team in and people were holding nothing but woodworking material and instruments, and they stand there with machine guns over them because they think they might have gotten wood that was illegal, which Gibson always maintained they did not. But I mean, you saw these kind of things. We heard horror story after horror story. Some poor little guy, and he was probably a Democrat. He had a fuel efficient car. He was trying to come up with a new kind of battery that would hold more energy. And he sent two chemicals to Alaska to have a process done on them. And he knew that under the law, or not the law, but the regulations, he had to send it by ground. So he
Hmm.
checks the box by ground only, not knowing that there's a new regulation that requires you to put a little sticker on the package that had an airplane with a line through it. He didn't put the sticker with the airplane with a line through it. He's driving home one day, three black Suburbans zoom up, one in front, one behind, force him off the road, throw him out of the car on the ground, boot on the back, handcuff him. He had no idea what he'd done. And since they had the choice of whether to charge him at his home or up in Alaska, they took him to Alaska where he didn't know anybody, kept him in jail for 18 months or so, as I recall. And anyway, he was acquitted. So then they had charged him with abandoning chemicals that had to be checked on every 2 weeks. Well, the reason he couldn't check on him was because they had him in jail in Alaska, and he went to jail for that. But anyway, this is the way
Wow.
our federal government had just gotten really sick. And that was not the FBI, but it was the mentality, we're the big feds. And basically, you had SWAT teams in all these different departments. But going back to the FBI, they became the worst. And it was an FBI I didn't recognize, FBI agents didn't recognize, and more got out. But Kash Patel hopefully can turn that around. There have been some proposals that maybe we create a separate federal law enforcement and then have a commission to screen people to see who might be okay to put in there who hadn't been corrupted. But when you see the FBI idolizing people like Peter Strzok and Andrew McCabe, you know, you
These are
you got a
communists.
real problem. You have a real problem.
So the FBI, the kind of the story. This is fascinating, by the way, Louis. So the story is this five up or out. It basically created a self-induced purge. So those who actually wanted to do their job could only do their job for 5 years. They didn't want to do a desk job, so they left. Now who is remaining are essentially servants that want to keep their job and their title that'll execute anything. Now, the story, I've never heard the story about the guy with the battery in Alaska. That makes complete sense to me, considering most of the Democrats who
Yeah,
have controlled the FBI have their money in electric vehicles. They have their
yeah.
money in
Except they
renewable
went
energies.
after this guy, but please understand, Eric, this was one of hundreds of stories that were gathered about abuses by federal law enforcement. That was just one. There's so many. I could spend hours
Go for it.
telling
Go
you
for it.
some of the. There are too many, and there's too much we want to talk about. But just let me tell you, there have been so many abuses, knocking down doors of people in the middle of the night, dragging people out in their underwear. I mean, what kind of that is Gestapo tactics.
That's
And
exactly
I've
right.
gone back again and relooked at the things the Gestapo did and their techniques that our FBI was using to intimidate and basically what the Gestapo wanted to do was not just abuse the people they were arresting, but send a message to everybody else. You either do what we say or this will be you next. So Orwellian. And
Yeah, the
as
only
I,
thing they didn't have was firing squads. That's the only
yeah,
that was
yeah,
the end game for the Gestapo was the
yeah,
firing squad. You either
yeah.
obeyed or you were put against a wall, and we haven't gotten to that point, thankfully. But it is a scary thing. So Cash Patel, day one, get rid of 5 up or out. That's a
Well, it
great place
became
to start.
7 year up route, and I'm not sure what Christopher Wray has done if he's kept that policy. But the thing is, though, Eric, once you had that in place for a number of years, then it became self-fulfilling that you knew you had to be a yes person. Well, and I'll give you one other example. The prosecution of Ted Stevens, that happened after Mueller became FBI director. He was senator from Alaska, and he could be a bit snarky in my opinion, but they created a case that didn't exist to prosecute him, and they tried him. It seems like it was a couple of weeks before his election. He narrowly lost the election, but he was convicted of accepting, free work from a contractor friend of his.
I remember that.
And he
Yeah.
had the documents originally that were showing that he was paying. And in fact, there was indication of evidence that wasn't found after the FBI took everything and didn't let him have his own evidence back, that he had a note from the contractor saying, "Hey, you're overpaying for this stuff." And he said, "Hey, I got too many people watching me. I
He
gotta
was
follow the law,
overpaying.
so I gotta pay." So he does when they grab all of your computers, every document in your house, anything that you could use to show your innocence, and they don't give those things back to you, then you have a problem defending yourself. And that's what Ted Stevens had. And after he was convicted, not the agent in charge of the case, but the the agent assisting that one, felt so bad about it, had such a guilty conscience, he did an affidavit asserting that we did, prevent him from having evidence he needed. And we threatened a witness to change his sworn story or we would prosecute him. And we got him to change his story. And this man should never been convicted. So the judge threw it out, condemned the FBI and the prosecutor. And what did Mueller do? They took away the security clearance of the man that had a conscience and did the affidavit and basically promoted the one that fabricated the case. So that was, that was part of Mueller's past as FBI director. And those things were seen. You look at a number of people that got treated the same way.
Donald
It,
Trump's one of them.
and yes, well, see that was after a history of these people going after political opponents. And Ted Stevens died in a plane crash that he wouldn't have been on. Not long after it came out, he was innocent. But he would have held that seat if he had not been convicted 2 weeks before. But these are the kind of things they've been doing, and it's why I'm encouraged very much that Kash Patel is the appointee. And if we don't get him through and get him confirmed, then I am very concerned it will be business as usual. And by the way, I've been misquoted on so many things that I've said, but one of them I was accurately quoted on was the comment that the only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. It wasn't 1984,
That's right.
but it is now. I mean,
That's right.
Eric, we had people in Congress that were saying there's so much misinformation. We need a ministry of truth. Holy cow, that was right out of 1984. And as I pointed out to some of them, Well, you forgot to mention that we also need Orwell's ministry of love. That's the people that come and arrest you and take you to the basement of their big building and hold you there for days, months, years, whatever, until you not only confess that your truth was a lie, but that you really believe it was a lie now.
Yeah.
Uh, that's the kind of stuff these people are pushing, and
Well, 1984 is what we live in, and it's
it
ironic
is.
that the Democrats who continually talk about us banning books, which are generally pornography shown to
Yeah,
elementary
yeah.
school kids, that the books that they've banned from school. When was the last time a school forced the reading of 1984? It was probably in 1984. And if you look at there's the Ministry of Truth, Ministry of Love. Trump was essentially Goldstein was that his name, who like CNN was the 2-minute hate. Everyone had to go to CNN for 8 years and be the 2-minute hate against Donald Trump. The
Yeah,
character was exactly the same, right? He believed in free speech, free commerce, and they taught the entire populace to hate him. Now, the
yeah,
interesting thing about 1984, because it's exactly 40 years later, right? Your quote was correct. They got it. They jumped the gun a little bit. It's 2024 is where we live. But when you look at the intention of Eurasia in the book, the intention was to be in perpetual war, right? That was the intention. They were constantly at
exactly.
war, constantly in
Yeah,
fear, and everyone told on each other, and they had Big Brother on every wall. Well, we
yeah.
have that now, right? We have the Fed
Yes,
Now
we do.
program can look into the Supreme Court approved that not only can they look into your financial accounts, they can also look into your relatives' financial accounts if you owe taxes.
Great.
We
Yeah,
are so
great.
close to a complete
Yeah,
tyrannical takeover. And the thing that gets me about 1984 that people don't pay attention to is how similar society is today based on a book. And Orwell wasn't even his name. His real name was Eric Blair. He's a relative of Tony
yeah,
Blair. That was a pen name.
yeah.
So the entire Blair family has been around this
Eric, I
predictive
love the
programming.
fact you know so much. That's just wonderful. Yeah, I don't meet people that know as much as you very often, so that's a real pleasure. But yeah, and his accounts of the torture, some have wondered since. Oh, and by the way, he wrote that about the ongoing wars before Eisenhower ever said anything about the military-industrial complex.
That's correct.
And actually it was in the late 40s, and people weren't thinking in terms of the military, that there might be forces that want the military to stay in war. So he was ahead of his time, but he was dying of cancer and he was suffering. And some have wondered if some of the barbaric treatments that he endured may have inspired some of his accounts of the torture
That's
that was
true.
administered on people in the basement down there of the Ministry of Love. But I love that you're aware of all that. Yeah,
Well, the other thing
so
is the other
it is
other
a
book is
dangerous
Animal
time.
Farm, right? Animal Farm is
Yeah,
a depiction of where we are today. Isn't that where the CIA trains? The farm, right? They train the ranchers to
yeah,
control the cattle,
they
and
call
we
it
have
the
the
farm.
CIA and the
They call it the
FBI,
farm. Yeah, yeah,
two
they call it
rogue
the
enterprises right now that are destroying this country and foreign countries. Now, in
farm.
1984, the perpetual war, right? Eurasia,
Yeah,
Oceania, always at war, always sending
right.
young men who could make a change in society off to die in a foreign land so that the powerful tyrants could always remain in power and wealthy. This
Yeah,
is exactly what was designed for America, beginning with Obama, in my estimation. Now, it's going to lead into a very interesting topic is the drones. So the drones that we're looking at right now, obviously there's about 12 different types that we're seeing. There's orbs, which could easily be LED screens to make you believe it's an orb on the bottom of a drone. I don't think people put that together. But if we look at this foreign war racket that we're living in, and that's what we're living in, right? So the UN was created, and the purpose of the UN, which was created by Bolshevik Russia, right, was Stalin being a main figurehead of the UN, saying the whole purpose of the UN is to never have any wars. We've had 69 wars. We're approaching 72 wars now, officially fought under this pact of peace, where only 5 nations control the future. And I think Gaddafi was executed for pointing this out in a UN statement to Obama, where he actually said, this is one thing, Louis, I loved. I got the translated AI translated version of Gaddafi's UN speech from 2009. And he started out by thanking Obama, a son of Africa, right?
Mm,
He said, Obama is a son of Africa. Now, most of us know Obama was not a US citizen, that his birth certificate was absolutely doctored, and that's
Well,
been
his birth
proven.
certificate appeared doctored, but his mother was a citizen, and
Yes.
like with Ted Cruz, that made him a citizen.
And Ted was
So
Canadian.
then we can get into debate over, whether that is what was the requirement entailed. Did you have to actually be born in the United States, or were you natural born by being born to a
Of
citizen? So
heritage.
we can get in those debates, but
Well, that's not the
yeah,
point. The
I
point
never
is,
knew why he wasn't more forthcoming about that. It should have been an easy thing for him to deal with, and I didn't
well, like
understand
with
why
any
he wasn't.
criminal, you watch the actions, right? So you have the
Yeah.
assumption, and then you watch the actions. And one of the actions of the Obama administration, which you served under, like, so you were there for the entire thing, was the
Mm.
regulation changes at ports. So the last thing that I read was that in the 8 years Obama served and the year after, because it took a while for new regs to kick in, only about 3% of the containers coming into this country were inspected at the ports under the
That's right.
Obama regulations. That leads to very dangerous things. So we now have these drones that are flying all over the East Coast. We're seeing them in Utah, California, Oregon, and there are many people out there. There's theories everywhere, and I have my
Yeah.
own, but they're
So do you
theories.
think those are just drones bringing McDonald's to Chris Christie?
That was the by the way, that was the best tweet of the entire year so far, was
That
the
was
drone.
hilarious, wasn't it? Wow, that was hilarious. But it is serious, and I agree with what President Trump said. There are people in the federal government that know where they come from and know where they go to land, and they have to. Otherwise, our intelligence and all the trillions of dollars that's been spent on intelligence and defense has been worthless. Sure, they have to
Mhm.
know. So that, and I know Jeff Van Drew, and I like Jeff a lot. Was saying he had information that they were from Iran, and so there's been a lot of speculation. But the thing that makes more sense is, and again, it is speculation, but that these are our drones and
Yes.
our people know where they come from, because otherwise they know that drones, especially some of those the size they are a threat, and you can't have them penetrating our airspace. And so for them not to even bother to shoot them down and to say we don't know where they're coming from.
They haven't even questioned them, get alone shoot them down. They're not even asking questions. They're just
Yeah,
telling us, "No, no, don't
no,
worry about it. Don't
don't
worry about
worry
it. It'll
about them.
pass."
So it seemed to indicate they must know they're lying once again. So what are they looking for? And like you're talking about the containers being inspected and the tiny percentage that is. Look, this has been an issue going back, a concern going back to the 90s. And I remember after 2001, when President Bush said, who would ever dream somebody'd fly a plane into a building? I'm going, well, Tom Clancy about 7 or 8 years ago had that in a book.
That's
Uh,
correct.
it wasn't radical Islamists, but sure, people had thought of that. And so one of the concerns for 30 years has been somebody smuggling a nuke or nuclear components into the U.S. and assembling a nuclear bomb. And there's supposedly a report that there's some uranium that's missing.
Mhm.
It's not a big threat, supposedly, but uh, okay, so maybe they're looking for gamma rays or some radioactive footprint where they can find any potential problems. And I would just assume they tell us if that's what the situation is, but they're not being forthcoming. They're not being honest. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the nuclear threat is real. If we have, 3% of containers smuggled in through an 8-year period, 8 years ago, almost 10 years ago, you have, nuclear shelf life is very long. So our enemies play the long game. You can go back to 1963 congressional records of the Chinese takeover of America, 49-point plan, 48 of them have already been accomplished. So do we have enemies with long intentions to conquer America that could have smuggled in nuclear materials? Absolutely. The other thing that I've heard is I called a friend of mine who was a black box operator who worked with a lot of special forces teams on training missions.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they would do is they would modify US drones to look like Iranian drones. It's a very common
Mm.
practice.
Huh.
So they would do this in an attempt to create realism, and they do this quite often in the East Coast. So this isn't a new thing. It's just the size of these drones. You're talking about drones the size of a minivan. These are easily weaponized. Could easily have, different propulsion than we're used to. I think that this is my opinion is I think this is designed as a major distraction from what's happening economically in this country. I think that we are teetering, we have a bullet hole with 26 years of band-aids on top of it. The bullet hole's
Yeah.
still leaking. And we have
Well,
government corruption being exposed. 8,000 people were just pardoned. 8,000 people
it's
were given
incredible.
a pardon.
Yeah. Incredible some of those who some of those people were. But before we get away from the issue of the drones, there is a big concern uh, since we know historically in the last 30 years that so often Democrats accuse Republicans of what they themselves are doing, have done, or want to do, like the Russia hoax,
Mhm.
people colluding with Russia were the Bidens and the Clintons. Ukraine demanding a quid pro quo. Well, it wasn't Trump, but Biden was on video
Saying
admitting
exactly
that
that word for word.
bragging about demanding a quid pro quo. So we know they constantly blame Republicans for what they've done or thinking about doing. Well, they were accusing him of wanting to create a situation where he had to declare martial law and postpone the inauguration so he could stay in office. Well, that's not necessary, and it is something that they may try to do. I mean, desperate to hold on to power, since the Marxists were so close in taking over. They're not going to go quietly. I expect there will be violence, and they know the Biden administration and the DC administration are so lethargic when it comes to protecting people in the city and the country. So, but let me just say that no matter what is going on January 20th, President Trump and Vice President elect Vance can be sworn in. If you go back to 1876, in that election, neither candidate got the required number of electoral votes, and there were alternative electors just as John Kennedy was setting up for in 1960 in Hawaii. It ended up he didn't need them, but when Nixon conceded, Al
Hmm.
Gore was in the process of setting up alternative electors. Well, that's what happened in 1876. If they're in dispute, you need to have alternate electors who vote on December 6th, as the Constitution requires. And so anyway, it was crazy, and it was before the 20th Amendment set some of these things straight. But President Grant set up a commission with the agreement of Congress, and they investigated and awarded the votes, and they awarded the disputed votes to Rutherford B. Hayes.
That's right.
And there was so much fear. President Grant and President elect Hayes had fear that there was going to be riots and he would never be able to be sworn in on the Monday election day. Back then, it was set for March 5th. The 20th Amendment in 1933 established it as January 20th. But he went to the White House and met the Chief Justice and was sworn in 2 days early, so that if there were riots or anything to keep him from being sworn in, it wouldn't be a
Interesting.
problem. He would already be able to take control. So, and we also know from the example that John Adams set in 1801 when Thomas Jefferson was being, and David, the book on John Adams David did was so great. But he pointed out Jefferson hired a notorious newspaper guy to create lies about Adams that helped him win. And
It's been going on
and
forever.
yeah, and so Adams was so mad about it, and they had been friends. It was Adams that said, Jefferson, you're the best writer of the three of us. Why don't you write the first draft of the Declaration of Independence? And then Jefferson, the first person he showed his draft to was Adams. They were friends, but not after that election. And so Adams left. He didn't stick around. There is no need for the president to stick around and be there for the inaugural swearing in. So you don't even need Biden there. You just need the Chief Justice, and you need a witness, and you need President-elect Trump, Vice President-elect Vance, have them sworn in, and we're done, even if
Wow.
riots are preventing anything from happening. So there should never be an excuse. No, we're going to have to postpone the inauguration. No, you don't. There is absolutely no reason to do that whatsoever. You just, even if you can't do it there on the west side, where Reagan started that tradition, or the east side where it was up until Reagan's inaugural in 1981. You can still do it in a bunker somewhere, an undisclosed location, and we're
That's
good.
interesting.
The
Wow, that's
last
interesting.
thing we need is the Biden administration that has their fecklessness and weakness have encouraged, it would just turn the world into a powder keg.
Mhm.
So the last thing we need is for him to stay 1 minute longer than the law requires. And I'm still a little aghast that you could have a special prosecutor look at whether President Biden should be prosecuted for having classified documents in his garage, totally unprotected.
Door wide
And the
open.
whole
Yeah.
basis for the investigator saying he shouldn't be prosecuted is that he doesn't have the mental fitness to be successfully convicted. And
But
yet,
yet he can run the
guy that
country
doesn't
and
have the mental fitness to be convicted stays president after that. I mean, and of course, Kamala and everybody else covered with him for so long. But I think historians will look back at that and go, he's not fit to be
to be
convicted
tried.
mentally, and yet they let him run the country for the rest of the year. That's not smart. And it
Yeah,
was.
I giggle at it, but it's scary. I mean, that's the, again, weakness breeds strength, right? So the weaker we are, the stronger our enemies feel. And in this era where they're emboldened, right? Could be hubris, right? We're a very powerful
Yeah,
nation. Hubris is a strong vehicle for all types of nefarious activities. Now
yeah,
we have these drones. So going back to, the disguising them as Iran training exercises,
yeah. I'd not heard that before.
more than likely the well from my contact, more than likely these are training exercises that are anticipating some sort of activity in those regions, so they're mapping it, they're queuing it. We may see something like that in the next 40 days or 30 days, whatever it is. We have no idea. What we do know is that what we've talked about, we've gone from Obama, who's a communist, and he's caught reading Marxist books over and over again. He has Marxist ideology. He created race wars. These are all, I try to educate on this podcast. And what you talked about, how the Democrats project what they're doing upon the Republicans, that is straight out of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. That is
Yep,
literally a
yep,
playbook of how to take over a nation through communist tactics. So these are
yep,
clearly Marxists that have run this country, sold it out. We're in Texas. Some of our toll roads are owned by corporations in Spain, right? So we've been sold out along the way. And now we have the end of an era, right? The end of the weakness that can be portrayed to the world. Do you think that that's a legitimate concern for America, that maybe there'll be some sort of military conflict in those regions?
no, I think that this administration being so weak has created a situation where our enemies think, well, if we're ever going to do it, we better do it before Trump takes over because he's a strong guy and Biden's been a weak, feckless guy. So, yeah, as you said, and that's
Oh,
one of
geez.
the lessons of history, weakness promotes aggressiveness, in bad actors. And so I'm very concerned about potential violence in the world and in the United States between now and January 20th. But no matter how much chaos they may create, it's no reason to postpone that swearing in. no matter where it gets done. We should not allow the Biden administration that has created these problems and created this atmosphere where the bullies are in charge. Uh, we shouldn't leave them in any minute longer than necessary.
I agree. So, Louis, you
Okay.
think that that's a possibility? I mean, I personally think everything is on the table until January 20th, honestly. But the most interesting thing about this is that you
Yeah.
don't need that official inauguration to swear someone in. That's something I don't think Americans know about.
Yeah. No, it's not necessary. The 20th Amendment that was ratified in 1933, it was passed in 1932, ratified, finished being ratified in 33. It says noon on January 20th. You know, because if you remember, Lincoln's, his inaugural addresses, I think, were in March. And so they had later inaugurations back then. But the 20th Amendment says noon on January 20th. That is the line of demarcation. That's the end of the outgoing president's power. And we just got to make sure that our president is sworn in to take over at noon on January 20th, no matter where it takes place. And there'll be a lot of us disappointed not to have a wonderful celebration outwardly filling the mall with people.
Absolutely.
But yeah, and without fear of Gestapo tactics being used against them for coming to the inauguration, that would be exciting. And it would be a real shame for that not to happen. But if it doesn't, not to worry.
It
Private
will be
swearing
done.
in, do the trick.
Well,
Yeah.
the Biden administration must not have read the 20th Amendment because I believe he was sworn in at 11:51. Just looking back at the video, I remember that.
Well,
So, very
but
Biden thing to
see, but
do.
that's still not a problem. It still constitutionally doesn't take effect until noon. You can be
It's the
sworn in a
effect.
little early, but it still doesn't take effect till noon, no matter how early you're sworn in. So, President Trump could be sworn in earlier than that. Yeah.
Well,
But I was talking to Vice President Cheney years ago when we liked each other. And I asked him, I said, was it true that Bill Clinton set this terrible precedent of the outgoing president not showing up for the prayer service that they've had traditionally, I think since Jefferson in that same church, but where outgoing, incoming, they go for the prayer service early on inauguration morning. And I said, I understood he left y'all sitting there like 45 minutes just waiting because he couldn't show up on time. And he said, no, that's true. And he said, we found out what he was doing during all that time. That's when he was signing all these pardons for people before he came to the prayer service. And so apparently we were all sitting there as he was
wait, he was signing
getting
pardons?
people out of jail free.
Oh my God. I did not know that at all. He was signing pardons while you guys were waiting for him at a prayer service? He didn't even wait. He didn't even wait like an hour?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, he made everybody wait 45 minutes after it was supposed to start because he was in the White House signing pardons.
Wow.
And
Louis,
he
I thought you were
knew
going to
he
take a different route with that. I thought you were going to say that he was doing something else in the White House that he's known for.
no,
So,
no. I think by that point Hillary was watching him too closely for him to do that. But yeah, and it is interesting. It's difficult to go in the two rooms adjoining the White House where President Clinton apparently conducted his extracurricular activity without thinking about, holy cow, that's what he was doing in here. Anyway,
oh,
oh well.
geez. The calamity really kind of began with him. I mean, I guess you
Yeah,
could go back to Carter, but yeah, there were the calamity. The downfall of America has been very, very well executed by enemies and infiltrators. That is pretty
yeah,
obvious to those who research. Now let's get into foreign funding. So, this is a topic when you bring up Cheney, you kind of have to bring up war and you have to bring up funding enemies
mhm,
overseas covertly. We are in a mess right now, Louis. We are spending just the last time I looked, and since North Carolina was devastated by Hurricane Helene, there are still people living in tents sleeping in the snow. Their children are being taken from them, our own people. And in that time frame, we've spent $192 billion on foreign nations to secure their countries. When does this end? How can Trump stop this train of foreign aid, of the constant money printing in America, the impoverishing of each new generation of American becomes poorer based on buying power? Yes, your fathers before you did not make as much money as you do, but their money went a lot farther.
Yeah.
And we are impoverishing generation after generation. And I don't see how we get out of this in the end.
Yeah.
What is
I
that?
think,
How do you stop this?
well, that began with TARP. We had a 160 billion or so projected shortfall in the 2007 appropriations that we did in '06. And by 2009, because of TARP and then the 800 billion that Obama wanted on top of that, it went to about 1.5 to 1.6 trillion. And we've never looked back. We've never reined it in from that. That can be done, but I'm really optimistic about Elon Musk and Vivek's work on how we can rein in our government. But a lot of it is the spending. And I had a bill, I believe I filed it every term I was in Congress. I almost got it passed as an amendment to the NDAA back years ago, but it was the UN Voting Accountability Act, is what I called it. And Jim Jordan said, I use your quote a lot and sometimes give you credit, but the comment is, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free.
Yeah.
So the UN Voting Accountability Act says any nation that votes against the U.S. position on contested matters more than half the time will receive no aid of any kind from the United States during the subsequent year. You can go ahead and hate us and hate what we stand for, but we're not going to pay you to hate us. You're going to have to do that on your own. And so I thought that would be a start for one. And actually, Eric, I looked in at one time, we get so many spies coming into the United States that are affiliated with the UN and the people they bring in, and all these governments play that game. But I wondered, since the UN is clearly no longer our friend and they're more supportive of China, and they seem, and was Russia, and they could nix anything through their veto. But why not, if you're going to have the UN, let them do it in Europe?
Yeah.
Go to Brussels, go to Amsterdam, wherever you want to go. And so I looked in, what we need to do, what kind of leash did the federal government give them? Well, it turns out it was deeded to the UN by the Rockefeller Foundation. The US government did not own it. And it basically, so long as it's used as the primary headquarters for the UN. So, I mean, there are things you could do. The UN is not being helpful. I mean,
No.
they are, and the World Health Organization helped cover up COVID and protect China. Uh, and, anybody that's been a prosecutor, you look for evidence. What would support a charge? In this case, what would support a charge that China knowingly spread COVID around the world? Well, they found out there was a leak. They found out that COVID had been released, and they grounded the domestic flights within China so they couldn't spread it around China, but they allowed the international flights to go on. To
I
me,
remember that. I was in New York when they announced that. I still remember
yeah,
hearing that on the
to
news.
me, that is clear evidence of an intent to spread death around the world.
Agreed.
It's, I mean, you take those two things, yep, they knew what they were doing and they knew they were spreading death to the world. And yet, the World Health Organization, who, yeah, World Health Organization, they were, they protected them. They covered up for them.
1,000%.
Yeah. And so those are not things we should be paying toward. And by the way, when it comes to paying, you know how you hear time to time there are over 100 countries that are demanding that the United States, join the world in stopping climate change and sign on to the agreement. Well, the reason that they say it won't work if we don't sign is because under that agreement, we're the country that has to pay all the other 100 plus
That's right.
countries that are signatories. So, yeah, no, it doesn't work unless we're there because we're the only one that pays. China is considered a developing nation, so they don't have to comply. And yet they're the worst polluter on the planet,
That's
which is
right.
also an indication that people that say they're all about stopping climate change, they're not being honest because if they
No.
were, their number one target would be China. And the hundreds of new carbon are actually coal plants, power plants
Hmm.
they've created in recent
One a
years.
week. They're
Yeah.
building one a week.
Do you hear any of the climate change fanatics talking about that? No.
Oh no.
And by the
No.
way, in one of our hearings, I asked this guy supposedly familiar with the history of temperatures, and I said, "Well, uh, is it your belief that the back when the Norse came to Greenland and they had these wonderfully productive farms that they were colder then than we are now, that the world was colder then than we are now?" And he, in effect, said, well, okay, it was warmer apparently in the northern hemisphere, but we don't have enough readings on the southern hemisphere. So we can't really say the planet was warmer back then. And so, climate, I was taught in school, climate have cycles, they change.
That's right.
And of course, when one of the Democrats screamed as he finished speaking, and there's not one of you on your side of the aisle that even believes in climate change, I was the next speaker and I said, well, I take issue with what you're saying. I not only believe in climate change, I know it's a fact. And where I live in East Texas, we have it 4 times a year. I know it's a fact. I believe in it. Yeah. And it's a good thing.
Well,
But
you follow the
anyway,
money on these things. The global
yes,
so
that's
I was at
what
Freedom
it
Fest
comes
in
down
Memphis
to.
last
What
year.
it comes down to. Exactly.
I got a standing ovation at a oil and gas panel, which never happens because Michael Schellenberger asked me, he said, Eric, what are your thoughts on the climate change agenda? And I said, well, it's the largest confidence scam in US in the world's history. The end game is a $90 trillion tax extortion from people all throughout the world to make an attempt to change the environment executed by the same people who can't keep potholes off of our roads. That is what's common. I'm a South Side Chicago kid. That is called a confidence scam. That is a scam. And we are all being privy to this. The nice thing is that people are starting to wake up to this scam. They're starting to realize that, climates do change. They're starting to realize that we have powerful technology that can assist in that climate change. I've been banned for that episode, by the way. And we also have a very greedy, tyrannical government globally through every nation throughout the world. There is not a single government out there that isn't operated by globalists at this point in time. And they have a big plan to extort $90 trillion from the world on a scare tactic that if we don't change things now, like we heard it like the 70s, we'd run out of oil, the 80s, there would be the beaches would no longer exist, even though they're buying homes in the beaches. So
Yeah.
all these other things that we see along the way, this is another way of extorting capital and sending it overseas, because that's what we do with climate change bills. All the pork that's put into them, it's yeah, there's some stuff for climate change in America. Sure, certainly. Generally, it goes to the electric car companies that people like Elizabeth Warren own. So they get government subsidy for their for-profit investments. But
Yeah.
then we have the money going overseas to these gender change in Pakistan, or gay tolerance in Palestine. Muslim nations don't tolerate gay. Like, it doesn't matter how much money you're going to pump into that system. It's a failed
Yeah.
operation. So how do we
Yeah.
end this? The national debt itself, I think, gold, a combination of gold, Bitcoin, sound money, sound practices, what Doge is doing with Elon, and I'd love to see that Ron Paul is now being called upon as an advisor for that, because we need Ron Paul. So we
Yeah.
bring these guys in and clean it up, but the deficit itself is $36 trillion. I mean, that if you
Yeah.
counted a dollar a second, we'd be in 240,000 BC. Right? This is a
Yeah.
tremendous amount of money. and it just keeps piling up. How do we stop it in government from somebody who's been on the inside? Why are these bills passed? Where does that money go?
Because it's easier to just get along. As Sam Rayburn, former speaker from Texas, famous for saying, to get along, go along. And,
He's got his own highway in Dallas now.
but it's easier to just go ahead and vote one more time for this. We'll get it on the next time. And there's never a next time when we do anything about it. And I don't know if you saw, but Victoria Sparks has stepped out of the Republican conference
Mhm.
in Congress, which makes it pretty tough margin now. But Victoria, I like her, and she grew up in Ukraine. And by the way, some of our best citizens and most concerned citizens came from countries that experienced communism and
Absolutely.
exactly where they're trying to take our country. And they're the most vocal. And that's where Victoria is. And basically singing the song you were just saying about our spending, that we have got to get realistic, and we're just continuing to go along, and we've got to stop it. And there are a number of ways to do that. And Newt Gingrich proposed one that I thought we might actually follow up on, the debt ceiling. Well, none of
Mhm.
us want to vote to raise the debt ceiling, but Newt was saying that is a vehicle that you in the things we ended up passing that Boehner came up with. Hey, instead of raising a number, why don't we just say whatever it increases to by this date, that's okay? Really foregoing voting to increase it. You're just saying whatever you want it to increase to. It really crazy stuff. But if you say we're not increasing the debt limit, oh, but we'll end up, being claimed as faulting on all our debts. Well, what he said is you agree to raise the debt limit for amount that probably will cover 90 days in return for so much cut in spending. And you do that for a year, and you can get the budget down to where it's actually maintainable, and we're not running, you can get back to a balanced budget that Clinton takes credit for now, but it was the Republicans in the House and Senate demanding they were not going to vote for a budget that didn't balance. And so anyway, he takes credit for it, but he only signed it when it was clear it was going to likely
Just on
be
him. Yeah.
over his veto be overruled. So anyway, yeah, there
But
are
so
things like that that could be done, but it is so important that we cut down the size of the government. It is
absolutely.
just unwieldy. And one of the things, and this doesn't have to do with necessarily cutting the size, although I think it would contribute significantly. We have people, as we talked about early in the conversation, that have gone to jail for violating a regulation that some bureaucrat came up with that Congress was never aware of, never voted on. But Congress got lazy years ago and started passing laws, criminal laws, that said a violation here under or any regulation here under is punishable by. Well, we just allowed regulators to come up with criminal laws that
Mhm.
put people in jail, like we were talking about with the guy who wanted to make a battery.
Does the
This
Chevron
should,
deference ruling impact that? That
which one?
Chevron deference?
Chevron deference does not change the criminal laws that say a violation of this law or any regulation hereunder is punishable by such and such. It doesn't affect that, to my understanding. And
Hmm.
so I was pushing that bill, and I was surprised I couldn't get Republicans that I liked and respected to get that bill through committee and to the floor that says no one can lose their freedom, be arrested based on a law that was not actually passed by Congress, a regulation that was not affirmed by Congress. nobody should be capable of being arrested for something that no elected official had anything to do with. I
Agreed.
thought that was pretty basic, but we couldn't get the Justice Department, Republican or Democrat, to go along with it, and it never got to the floor for a vote. But these are things that have got to be done. And once you do that, you don't need so many regulators. You don't need so many SWAT teams
Hmm.
for regulators. You can cut the government down dramatically, and
And
that's
we
where we
have
need
to.
to
We're
go.
the largest employer in the history of the world, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. I mean, we are
And
so
and you
large.
get back to and I know, sure, you've talked about it. You get back to the 10th Amendment's true meaning. I mean, education is not an enumerated power of the federal government. Get it back
That's
to the
right.
states. All these things that were not enumerated powers under the 10th Amendment, it needs to go back to the states. Let them handle it and quit trying to do a one size fits all from Washington when you got 50 totally different states.
And we continue to send, and I'm asking this question, you don't have to answer it, but we continue to send, we have allotments every year. I think the last time I read is almost 150 billion a year is just set kind of like an auto draft, like you pay your cell phone bill, it just comes out of your bank account. Every year we send 3 billion to Israel, a billion to Kenya, a billion over here. The whole world just gets these instant distributions of US capital. And if anyone's ever read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which if you haven't, you certainly should. It's a fascinating book of how we build an empire based upon global national debt for smaller nations with heavy resources, which is us and China are battling to see who can rule the world through debt. That's what we're doing. But this isn't debt to them. We're making loans on top of distribution of cash. So these loans, and I know you've taken some heat for Israel in your career as well. I think you said that they actually breed an environment for radical terrorism, which I completely agree with, and I think any
But
historian who tells the truth would agree. But
well,
where does this money go? Where?
I don't believe Israel breeds terrorists, but there's going to be terrorists trying to attack
Of
Israel for the
course.
rest of history, and I do think we need an outpost in the Middle East, and that Israel is a whole lot cheaper outpost than we could ever have on our own, and a lot more effective. But no, I think they're part of the solution. But you're right about all this money that just goes pouring out.
Where does it
And
go?
well, and let me tell you this too. One of the problems came when, and I know people hate the term earmark, but earmarks have come to include legitimate federal projects. So once you eliminate line items for what we believe in Congress are legitimate federal projects, then what happens? We, figuratively speaking, we give massive sacks of cash to the executive branch, and then things we know to be legitimate federal projects, we have to get letters from members of Congress in the Senate saying, please, would you use some of your money for this legitimate federal project? And my feeling was that we could enforce the prohibition on evil parts of earmarks, the monuments to me, anything that might, enrich a member of Congress, family, business associates, because so much of that was abused. But you have prohibitions on things, but legitimate federal projects that aren't hidden deep in some bill, but, are legitimate. We should be that's the power of the purse. But we
Sure.
gave up the power of the purse by saying, okay, we're not line itemizing anything. Here's all the money. Now we'll beg you to spend it on good things. And so I constantly hear people ask, Eric, where did the Biden administration get the money to send here and send there and do this and build that? And well, we're not specific enough in our appropriations.
Hmm.
And that's how they get away with it.
All right. And so, Louis, we last year, I think it was last year, over the last 4 years, we've spent something like $5.8 million seeing if two males can breed a child in certain species. Like, is that the type of spending where they're testing, can two gay animals make a new animal, which we know scientifically is impossible? But this type of spending, that's the vagality that they deal with. They can just, spend the money any way that they see fit.
Uh, well, yeah, they can come up with plans like that. There's plenty of leeway for them to waste money like that. And those are things I'm very hopeful we're going to see an end to. But there's no reason that we should be spending the trillions of dollars we are. And just to provide you with a bit of education, I got years back at a meeting at Fed talking with some of our people. And anyway, I asked a question: how much more money are we printing now than we did, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago? And the people turned to a guy that knew, and he said, oh, well, it's really not that much different. It's not a whole lot of difference from what it's been 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, there's some difference, yeah. I said, but there's so much more money in the system now. And he said, oh, and I'm quoting, we couldn't possibly print all the money we are creating. So, so, yeah, you're laughing because holy cow, we're not even bothering to print it anymore.
Yeah, we don't
We
even
just
know. We have no
add
idea how much money is
digits.
in
No,
circulation.
and in a private meeting some of us had with Bernanke, we asked, are we monetizing our debt? Are we buying our own debt? And he looked all of us in the eye and said, no, we are not monetizing our own debt. And then we find out, yeah, we are. It's
100%
just
we are.
that it's worse than that. We were paying a third party, and they got money for doing it so that they would buy our debt. So we could say, well, we're not buying it. We're paying this third party to buy it, and we're giving them a fee for doing it. That's even worse than if
It's
we were
even
buying
worse.
our own debt. So, anyway, it is a significant concern. And you're right to bring it up. If you remember when we burst through and hit this, went from projected 160 billion deficit in '07 to 1.5 to 1.6 trillion, nearly 10 times more deficit in 2009. I believe it was S&P said, there are consequences for being this irresponsible. So they downgraded us, I think AAA to AA plus. And the Obama administration went after S&P, and they
Yes, they
made
did.
and they had to let the head of S&P go, and it sent a message to the others: you don't downgrade our debt, or we'll come after you. But we have continued to be so irresponsible. We had another entity recently, not long ago, that downgraded us again.
Moody's.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, Moody's, that's right. And when that happens, our debt interest becomes more expensive,
Hmm.
and we get even deeper debt. So you're right to keep bringing this up because we've got to deal with it, or there. John Adams said there are two ways to enslave a nation. One is with the sword, and the other is with debt.
Yep.
Uh, yeah,
And he was
and
right.
so, yeah,
The sword is gone. The day of the sword is gone, especially with 430 million firearms in America. Sword is not an option. Debt has been the option, which is why we're now discussing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And that's what I
yeah,
want to wrap this up on,
yeah,
because throughout your career and my career as well. So I wasn't always, didn't always understand Bitcoin, and very few people actually do. It's part of the mission I have, is to, if you can understand Bitcoin, you can understand crypto. They're different things. They
mhm,
serve different purposes.
right,
But the strategic Bitcoin reserve is kind of an admission that our spending is out of hand. So we're going to go to a scarce monetary asset that appreciates when more people buy it, as opposed to printing more
yeah,
as people buy it.
yeah,
And in that environment, one of the things that I know that many senators, many congressmen in 2020 and 2021 were critical of Bitcoin mining, saying it was an environmental disaster, uses too much energy. That myth has been dispelled. We are actually bringing power grids using Bitcoin mining to third world nations in Africa that nobody would put a power grid in for because there was no monetary purpose. Balancing the grids in this country by buying surplus and selling it back to the grid when the grid is low, and now using ethane and flare gas, like in the mine that we're building in Knoxville. That type of environment, I think, is changing. So we're watching this changing of the guard where 3-4 years ago, man, everyone hated Bitcoin. And now today we're talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves in the States, in the country, in various nations around the world. It just passed where it's a fair accounting value. So corporations today, I think 3 more companies added Bitcoin to their treasury. What are you seeing and what are you hearing from the inside on politics, on Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining within the circles you run in?
Well, what it appears to me from all I gather is that the globalists, those that would like to pursue a Marxist totalitarian state, they hate it
Yes.
because the way our Constitution has been unfortunately interpreted to allow our government to spy on its citizens, to know their banking transactions, setting up the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which, when that was coming up for a vote, I'm going, guys, if you want to look at somebody's bank records, you should get a warrant.
That's
When I
right.
was a judge, people had to come to me and they had to have sworn evidence that a crime has been committed and this person was probably involved, or you didn't get to look at the person's bank records. And one idiot government official told me, said, well, the banks get to see your records. Why shouldn't we? And I said, because the banks cannot throw you to the ground, handcuff you, and take you to jail, and the government can. You shouldn't have access to every part of everybody's finances. There's supposed to be some financial privacy, unless you are committing crimes. And if you're committing
Sure.
crimes, then yeah, sure, go look at the financial records, see how they're profiting. But that is all about control. And when they know everything you're spending and where you're spending it, and that's where we've been heading, then it is total government control. And as we've seen, when people fell out of grace, they could have their bank accounts frozen.
Hmm.
Um, that scares people. And on the other hand, it scares one world people that they might be able to have finances that we can't see.
Louie, this has
Okay.
been awesome, man. You can't see me, but I got a big smile on my face. I hope to have you on here again, and hope to see you making more rounds around the world because you're a level-headed guy. You're a common sense guy, and you are bold. So continue to do what you're doing, my friend. This has been so
Thank you.
fantastic.
Well, I was told that people can tell I'm level-headed because I drool evenly out of both sides of my mouth. So,
I didn't see any drool at all, my friend.
well, thanks so much, Eric. Pleasure
You got
being
it.
with you.
Thanks,
All
Louie.
right.
And as you all can see, we had a couple of technical difficulties during our interview here with Louie Gohmert. I just wanted to extend my deepest gratitude to him for taking the time to educate all of us on how things work in Washington, D.C. Such a great guy, such a great resource to be able to tap into, and a guy who's going to shoot straight from the hip and let you know how things really are. So, Louie, thank you again for being on the Rice Report and taking the time here. I apologize for the technical issues. We seem to have them quite often on Good Conversations. But God bless you. God bless this country. And we'll see you all next time on the Rice Report. Thank you so much.